Welcome to Interface Studies. My name is Saleh. This is the home screen of DK Eyewitness Encyclopedia of Space and the Universe, a CD-ROM published by Dorling Kindersley Multimedia in the late 1990s. You loaded the disk, waited for the drive to spin up, installed and ran the program, and the screen became a place. Not a menu, not a tab, not a list of articles. A room. Sometimes a Victorian observatory. Sometimes a study with labeled drawers and a brass microscope, like in the Eyewitness Encyclopedia of Nature. Sometimes a library, a workshop, a cabinet. Everything inside was an object that you could almost touch. The world was on the disk. The disk was finite, and the disk was yours. Children of a certain age spent hours in those rooms. I was one of them. 25 years later, those screens are still vivid to me in a way that very little software since has been. Now, away from nostalgia, the interesting question is not whether the experience was beautiful. It is why this kind of software became somewhere I and many others return to. Why so little software since has. Why is browsing Wikipedia late at night not quite the same thing? Why is asking an AI to explain astronomy and generate diagrams not the same thing? The answer has to do with the quality the encyclopedia and some software of that era had, and most current software does not. The simplest word for it is place. This video is about when software starts to feel like somewhere instead of something. What gives it that quality, why it has become rare, and where it still survives. Now, the interesting thing about place and our software is that we use the language of place for software constantly. We speak of being on X or Twitter, or being in Slack. We describe certain games as somewhere we used to live. A forum feels different after a redesign. The language becomes spatial almost automatically. Now, part of this has already been formalized in the academic literature. In 1996, Steve Harrison and Paul Dourish published a paper called Replacing Space at the CSCW conference. Their argument is that space is geometric arrangement, the measurable layout of an environment, while place is space that has acquired social and behavioral meaning through use. Their declared principle, repeated 3 times across the paper, is that space is the opportunity. Place is the understood reality. Their most consequential observation for the argument here is this: placeness can be designed for, but it cannot be designed in. A designer can build the conditions under which placeness emerges by arranging the environment and supporting continuity over time, but cannot manufacture placeness directly. It develops through return, ritual, and use. Harrison and Dourish were writing about collaborative systems, their shared workspaces, and the early virtual worlds of mid-90s research. The argument here in this video extends the same distinction to authored single-user software, where the conditions for placeness are created by editorial design rather than by communal use. The encyclopedia is a place not because people gather in it, but because someone has authored it as one in such a way that a user returning over time can build a relationship with it. The interesting thing is that once we start looking for the distinction, it becomes hard to ignore. Some software feels inhabitable. Most does not. Wikipedia can occasionally feel place-like during long stretches of exploration, but it is fundamentally designed for retrieval. Most marketing websites are not places. They are corridors. Most modern apps are not places. They are forms. The encyclopedia on the screen feels like a place in a way that almost nothing in the same category since has managed. This is the puzzle worth unpicking. To start, I'm going to go with the easy case. Games. Games make the idea easiest to see. Minecraft, Stardew Valley, Animal Crossing, EverQuest, Disco Elysium, all unmistakably places. What gives them that quality has surprisingly little to do with graphical realism or technical sophistication. It comes down to four things. The world has stable spatial layout. Rooms matter. Distances matter. You remember where things are because they are still there when you return. Secondly, the world has a recognizable identity, a frame of its own. A screenshot from Stardew Valley is not interchangeable with a screenshot from Animal Crossing. Each game looks and sounds like itself, not like everything else built from the same engine. Thirdly, the world has edges. Even very large games feel bounded. You can sense that you are inside something with limits, not floating in an endless stream. Finally, the world has affordances tied to location. What you can do here is different from what you can do there. A village is not a cave, is not a workshop, and is not a menu screen. The differences are part of what makes each location distinct. These are the four properties this video will go through. Games preserve them because they are economically rewarded for doing so. The promise of a game is simple. Spend time in this world. Building the world is the product. The design instinct and the business incentive point in most cases in the same direction. Outside games, they often do not. But before going any further, we have a complication. Some software becomes a place without really being designed as one. Hacker News is that classic example. The interface is intentionally minimal. Almost no metaphor, no rooms, no framing at all. And yet, for many of the people who use it daily, it is clearly a place. They return to the same URL with the same expectations, recognize the rhythms of discussion, and know roughly when certain types of threads will appear. Over time, ritual produces familiarity. The same used to be true for long-running forums. Twitter for many users around a decade ago, and X for some people now. This kind of placeness is real, but fragile. It depends heavily on community continuity and on the interface remaining stable enough not to interrupt the habits forming inside it. When Twitter and Reddit and Facebook shifted towards algorithmic feeds, a lot of people felt that the place itself disappeared almost overnight. What mattered was not the interface alone, but the continuity of behavior happening inside it. The encyclopedia, the video game, and some software, as we're going to see in a bit, produce placeness through authored structure. The forum produces it socially. Both matter, but they survive disruption differently. The first kind can persist even in solitude. The second depends almost entirely on the people inside it. The rest of the video is mostly about the first kind, because it is the kind that has been allowed to leave commercial software. And I think it is the kind that would have to be deliberately recovered. So compared to the encyclopedia or software of that era in general, what happened that made this sense of place go away? Several shifts arrived over time. Most of them made reasonable sense individually. Let's start with the most common thing: the browser. The browser flattened the frame. Once the web became the main delivery surface for software, applications stopped controlling their own outer environment. Every product inherited the same surrounding structure: tabs, address bars, browser history, scroll behavior, back buttons. Software no longer fully owned the experience of being inside it. Then came the design systems. The design systems flattened the inside as well. Material design, Apple's human interface guidelines, Bootstrap, Tailwind, large component libraries. These systems solved real problems around accessibility, responsiveness, and development speed, but at the same time encouraged software to converge toward the same visual grammar. Most software today is assembled from reusable components, optimized for consistency and shipping velocity. Responsive design pushed interfaces away from fixed spatial arrangements because everything now had to work across every screen size. Then feeds replaced pages. Instead of returning to stable locations, users return to a stream that regenerates every visit. The structure no longer promises that anything will still be where it was before. Finally, we have another shift happening: generative interfaces. Until recently, the answer to a reference question was usually a page someone had arranged. Now, the answer is increasingly generated on demand by a language model. The information may arrive faster and often more conveniently, but something else disappears in the process. The page had a layout. The model's answer has a chat bubble. Even a cluttered web page full of ads was still a small authored environment. Someone had decided what belonged near what. Generated responses work differently. They synthesize answers dynamically instead of constructing stable environments. What disappears is not information. What disappears is arrangement. Placeness depends heavily on arrangement. Part of what made the old multimedia encyclopedia memorable was that knowledge became attached to location. You remembered the drawer with the fossils, the room with the telescope, the screen with the rotating planet. The information had somewhere to live. The cumulative effect of the browser, design systems, feeds, and now generation is that software has gradually stopped presenting itself as somewhere to inhabit. It is increasingly presenting itself as something to query. Now, there are exceptions, and the following are some personal examples that I found. And looking forward for your comments if you have any app or website that you feel like it's a place for you. Let's start with PostHog. PostHog rebuilt its marketing website in September 2025 to behave like an operating system. Windows snapping, multiple internal apps, slide deck-like presentation for information, and many other features. The strongest property here is the custom frame. PostHog refuses the standard scroll and footer template and gives its homepage its own visual grammar, aiming to make it recognizable from the screenshot before you read the name. Spatial layout follows. The home is a desktop you move around inside rather than a page you scroll down. The other example is Not Boring Software, the Seattle studio founded by Andy Allen. It ships a suite of everyday utilities: weather, calculator, a camera. The strongest property of the apps released by Not Boring Software is that the affordance is tied to location. Each app is a tiny self-contained world with its own physics, its own sounds, its own haptics, and its own visual identity. A Not Boring app does not feel like a utility implementing a function. It feels like a small room you have stepped into. A couple of older examples: The Elements and Shakespeare's Sonnets. They are the most direct continuations of the CD-ROM encyclopedia. In The Elements, every chemical element rotates as three-dimensional sample on its own panel. The periodic table is laid out as a physical object you can browse rather than a chart to consult. In Sonnets, all 154 poems are performed to camera by celebrities, with notes synchronized line by line. These two apps hold all four properties in the way the encyclopedia did. They are the proof that the form survives translation across media when someone commits to making it. There's also a related tradition worth mentioning, and it comes from Brett Victor's 2011 essay, Explorable-Explanations. It argued that computers should help people learn by letting them manipulate ideas directly instead of only reading a static text. This started a tradition of web-native interactive essays that has emerged through people like Bartosz Cichanowski and others. These works combine explanations, simulation, layout, and interaction into a single authored environment. Understanding emerges partly through exploration. But these pieces are usually scrolls rather than rooms, so they are not places in the full four-property sense. but they preserve something important from the encyclopedia. It is the idea that understanding can emerge from arrangement and interaction, not just retrieval. The old encyclopedia was technically limited. The resolution was low, the videos were tiny. The world fit on a disk. But someone had arranged it carefully enough that decades later, it still feels like somewhere. That quality is not really about nostalgia or skeuomorphic textures or multimedia access. It is about continuity, arrangement, memory, and the feeling that software has an interior. Much of modern software no longer wants to be inhabited. It wants to be frictionless, queryable, responsive, universal. The goal is often to reduce the sense of being inside a particular environment at all. Sometimes that produces better tools, but something is lost when every interface becomes interchangeable, every page becomes a feed, and every answer becomes a dynamically generated response detached from any stable position. Placeness in software, as Harrison and Dourish observed 3 decades ago, can be designed for, but not designed in. And I think it depends on two conditions. Someone has to take responsibility for arranging the environment, with its layout, its frame, its edges, and its locations. And also, someone has to be allowed to maintain that arrangement long enough for users to build memory inside it. Placeness in software is rare now because the conditions for it are rare. And until that changes, most software will not be a place.